Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. George Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr. Führer, and good morning, everyone. It is really a pleasure to be here at the Leadership Institute, and I want to thank you, Morton and Amanda Anderson, Brian Burness, and all of your colleagues who have extended your courtesies to me on this occasion. This morning, I'd like to talk to you about an American leader revered by nearly all conservatives, and about one reason why he remains so compelling. Of the 43 persons who have served as President of the United States, probably none devoted more rhetorical effort than Ronald Reagan to explaining and extolling America's national purpose. No American statesman ever associated himself so persistently with John Winthrop's metaphor borrowed from Jesus of a city upon a hill. In recent decades, no figure on the national stage has rivaled our 40th president as a preacher and expositor of what some have called America's civic religion. Reagan's contribution to the theory and practice of what we call American exceptionalism goes to the heart of our ongoing quest for identity as a people, and to American conservatives' sense of their own identity and mission. And it raises a question to which I will return. Is the American exceptionalism that Reagan championed still persuasive to his compatriots? But first, let us turn to Reagan. In 1981, during the opening phase of his presidency, he confessed to one of his biographers, "What I'd really like to do is go down in history as the president who made Americans believe in themselves again." But Reagan was more than an affable psychologist and cheerleader. He understood that if he were to persuade his countrymen truly to believe in themselves again, he must instruct them on who they were and on what they could become. A little over 4 years later, in September 1985, the Reverend Pat Robertson of the Christian Broadcasting Network interviewed Reagan at the White House. Mr. Robertson's first question was, "When historians write about the Reagan administration, what do you want them to say?" The president replied in part, "I guess maybe that just I helped perpetuate this great American dream." A moment later, Reagan admitted that he was optimistic about the future, and at the end of the interview, he explained why. "I am convinced," he said, "that this is a nation under God, and as long as we recognize that, believe that, I think he'll help us." In these two compact phrases, this great American dream and a nation under God, Reagan revealed much about the vision of America that had stirred his soul for most of his adult life. During these years, he became known as one of the country's most effective orators, and no subject inspired him to greater eloquence than his perception of the meaning of the American experience. More than most of our presidents, Reagan's path to the White House was marked by a series of powerful speeches, and it is in these that we may discern his unfolding understanding of American exceptionalism. Reagan's vision first found extended expression in a commencement address at William Woods College in Missouri in June 1952. He entitled his talk simply, "America the Beautiful." In his remarks, Reagan announced his belief that America was, in his words, less of a place than an idea. This idea, he said, was the inherent love of freedom in each one of us. The idea that deep within the heart of each one of us is something so godlike and so precious that no individual or group has a right to impose his or its will upon the people. That no group can decide for the people what is good for the people so well as they can decide for themselves. He confided that for some time he had thought of America as a place in the divine scheme of things that was set aside as a promised land, open to anyone in the world with the courage and desire to tear up roots and to strive for freedom. He closed by affirming that, again in his words, "This land of ours is the last best hope of man on earth." One may plausibly say that Reagan's career as America's history tutor began on that June day before an audience of a few hundred people at a small Christian women's college in Missouri. 5 years later, he was again a commencement speaker, this time at his own alma mater, Eureka College in Illinois. Once more, he expostulated on his vision of American uniqueness, but with a few important new twists. He informed his listeners that he had never been able to believe that America is just a reward for those of extra courage and resourcefulness who had managed to move to or be born here. No, America, he announced, was a land of destiny, with a mission and a responsibility to all mankind. Reagan told the graduating seniors of the college that they must perpetuate their heritage of freedom and literally hold it in trust for that day when we shall have fulfilled our destiny and brought mankind a great and long step from the swamps. In these two commencement addresses may be found in embryonic form the principal themes that Reagan would expound for the rest of his life. If the now middle-aged movie actor had confined himself to such messages of uplift, he might have remained a popular speaker and little more. But as he traveled what he called the mashed potato circuit in the 1950s and 1960s, he increasingly sensed that all was not well in his land of destiny. It appeared to him that not one but two serpents were threatening the survival of the American Eden, an enemy abroad and an enemy within. In response, Reagan made a fateful decision. In his ever more frequent public appearances, he undertook not simply to celebrate American exceptionalism, but to clarify its meaning and defend it against its foes. The external challenge was the more obvious one, the armed doctrine of communism and what he later called its evil empire, headquartered in Moscow. In his 1957 address at Eureka College, Reagan defined the Cold War this way. He said it was an irreconcilable conflict between those who believe in the sanctity of individual freedom and those who believe in the supremacy of the state. The unprecedented threat from world communism seemed only to deepen Reagan's perception of America's special role in human history. Time and again, he reminded his compatriots of their peculiar destiny, there's that word again, destiny, that God intended America to be free, to be the golden hope of all mankind. And he warned, great nations which fail to meet their responsibilities are consigned to the dustbin of history. But nations can also fall from within. And as the 1950s yielded to the turbulent 1960s, it was the domestic menace to American exceptionalism that preoccupied him even more. By the late 1950s, the Hollywood star turned political evangelist had completed an ideological transition from New Deal liberalism to what would soon become known as Goldwater conservatism. And I might interject that, in case you don't know this, Reagan, early in his life, in his adult life, was a very, very liberal Democrat. He voted 4 times for Franklin Roosevelt, once for Harry Truman, and for a brief time after World War II, he actually associated himself with some groups that later were accused of being communist fronts. But he got disillusioned by a process that I won't go into at this point, but certainly by the late 50s, in 1960, he had completed that transition from being an ADA member, Americans for Democratic Action member in 1947-48, liberal Democrat at that point, to being a conservative, and about 1960 became a Republican officially. The effects of this shift in his thinking was soon manifest in the way he elucidated his vision of America. Our land of liberty, he asserted, was also under assault at home from those who, wittingly or unwittingly, were steering us toward a bureaucratized, all-powerful state in which the government would be our big brother and the individual citizen would be absolutely powerless. In speech after speech, he railed at the growing complexity, profligacy, and unaccountability of centralized government. No government in history has ever voluntarily reduced its size, he thundered. In 1961, more than 50 years ago, he warned this. He said, "We now live in a permanent structure of government beyond the reach of Congress and actually capable of dictating policy. This power, under whatever name you choose, is the very essence of totalitarianism." And in a line he first uttered in the late 50s and often thereafter, including 13 times as president, he remarked, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction." As Reagan's attacks on the uncontrolled state grew in intensity, he introduced a new element into his conception of American exceptionalism. His country was unique, he now contended, not only for the reasons he had previously given, but also for political reasons, because of the political system it had instituted starting in 1776. In this land, he proclaimed, occurred the only true revolution in man's history. All other revolutions simply exchanged one set of rulers for another. Here, he said, for the first time, the Founding Fathers evolved a government based on the idea that you and I have the God-given right and ability within ourselves to determine our own destiny. The leftward thrust of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program in the mid-1960s goaded Reagan into developing still another feature of his brand of American exceptionalism. In the presidential campaign of 1964 between Johnson and Barry Goldwater, Reagan declared, "This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves." In the aftermath of Goldwater's defeat, an unabashedly populistic distrust of what Reagan called self-anointed elites increasingly crept into his discourse. Part of Reagan's genius lay in his ability to articulate his populistic libertarianism in language that resonated with Americans' sense of our own history. Whether one agreed with his anti-statist policies or not, no one could deny that a robust love of liberty and a distrust of overweening authority had been an integral part of America's heritage since the nation's founding. Reagan also made brilliant use of his sense of humor. By the deft use of wit and amusing anecdotes, he could simultaneously soften his tone and sharpen his message. Consider just 3 examples. He said, "Government is like a baby. It's an alimentary canal with an appetite at one end and no sense of responsibility at the other." Here's another. He said, "You know who the taxpayer is. That's someone who works for the government and doesn't have to take a civil service exam." And finally this. "If you want to make sure crime doesn't pay, let the government run it." In 1969, Reagan added another metaphor to his expanding symbology of American exceptionalism. In a speech in Washington, he quoted, evidently for the first time, the sermon of John Winthrop in 1630 about the city upon a hill. Reagan, as we know, fell in love with this phrase. It became, as it were, his signature line in his ballad of American history. For him, this single image seemed to capture the essence of what he termed the nation's destiny, quoting Reagan again, "to be as a shining city on a hill for all mankind to see." His exposition of American exceptionalism reached a rhetorical climax in 1974 in his address to the first annual Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, held in Washington, D.C. "You can call it mysticism if you want to," he told the audience, "but I have always believed that there was some divine plan that placed this great continent between two oceans to be sought out by those who were possessed of an abiding love of freedom and a special kind of courage. In no other society in history," he noted, "has the preeminence of the individual been so firmly established and given such a priority." As Reagan now focused his ambition on winning the White House, an interesting change occurred in his teaching and preaching style, and a final ingredient of his American exceptionalism came into view. In his speeches on public affairs during the 50s and 60s, he had frequently sounded a note of dire foreboding. "Freedom is fragile," he would assert, "and very few nations that lose their liberty get it back." But in the late 70s, even as stagflation raged here at home and storm clouds darkened overseas, Reagan turned increasingly hopeful about his country's prospects and deliberately linked his optimism to his interpretation of the American character. He said, "If there is one thing we are sure of, it is that history need not be relived, that nothing is impossible." Brushing aside the counsels of pessimistic fatalism, the populist libertarian conservative asserted that it was not the American people who were at fault, it was their leaders. He began quoting a line from Thomas Paine's Revolutionary War pamphlet, Common Sense. That line read, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." To which Reagan crisply added, "We still have that power." Embedded in his mature theory of American exceptionalism was the confident belief that in this land at least, renewal was still possible. By 1980, the year he won the presidency, the conceptual and rhetorical underpinnings of Reagan's vision of America were in place. At its heart was a single word: freedom. The right in his formulation of each individual to control his own destiny and work out his own happiness without subjection to the whims of the state. The linchpin of his grand design was his second favorite word, destiny. By permitting its citizens freely to fulfill their individual destinies, America, according to Reagan, could still fulfill its national destiny, to serve as a shining beacon and a keeper of the flame of liberty until men and women everywhere were free. It is not necessary to dwell this morning on the various articulations of American exceptionalism that Reagan delivered as president. What is notable is how frequently he raised the subject. If there was one lesson that the sermonizer-in-chief intended to impart from his bully pulpit, it was the message of America's uniqueness and mission that had elevated him to national prominence. Year in and year out, he championed his vision of America against all detractors and lived to see its enemies in retreat. More than 20 years have now passed since Reagan ended his political career. His memory and words continue to move multitudes, as attested by the number of visits to his speeches on YouTube. But how fares the belief system that his words communicated, the philosophy embedded in his definition of American exceptionalism? At some level, it still appears to resonate with much of the American public. In December 2010, a Gallup poll asked Americans whether the United States, because of its history and its Constitution, has a unique character that makes it the greatest country in the world. 80% of the respondents agreed, and 86% associated Reagan with this belief. If anything, the anti-statist core of Reagan's vision seems more powerful than ever, thanks to the Great Awakening known as the Tea Party movement. In his farewell address in 1989, Reagan had ringingly proclaimed, "Ours is the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government," and with three little words, "We the people." We the people tell the government what to do. It doesn't tell us. We the people are the driver. The government is the car. The Tea Party activists of today could not have said it better. Indeed, it seems to me as a historian that from the perspective of the past 2 decades, it is increasingly apparent that one of Reagan's most important achievements was to revitalize and perpetuate a libertarian aversion to meddlesome and unaccountable government, an aversion long ingrained in the American psyche. So, Reagania still rules, or does it? In 2013, evidence mounts that for all of the great communicator's continuing personal popularity, his shining city upon a hill has become bitterly divided against itself. Debate about the once obscure term American exceptionalism has exploded on the internet, a sure sign that the national temperature is rising. In the 2010 Gallup poll that I just mentioned, for example, fully 91% of Republicans agreed with the proposition that America has a unique character which makes it the greatest country in the world. Among Democrats, the percentage in agreement was significantly smaller, 73%. It is difficult to resist the conclusion that the American exceptionalist gospel, if you will, that Ronald Reagan preached is no longer as powerful a bonding agent as it was in his lifetime. Three trends in the post-Reagan era help us to understand why. The first, which Reagan identified in his farewell address, is a rising tide of amnesia about America's past and its animating principles. It seems no accident that according to the polls, Americans under 30 adhere less strongly to the tenets of American exceptionalism than do any other segments of the population. In the words of a report from the Bradley Foundation in 2008, America is facing an identity crisis, brought on in part by the failure of our country's educational system to impart an adequate knowledge of our history and founding ideals to the next generation. As a result, the Bradley study concluded, America's memory appears to be slipping away. A second challenge to Reagan's vision is the attenuation in recent decades of religious consciousness and observance among a growing number of Americans. In 2010, a Gallup poll reported that the percentage of Americans who say religion is not very important to them in their daily lives has risen to 19%, a significant uptick since Reagan's time in office. Indeed, according to a report just last October by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, 1 in 5 American adults now has no religious affiliation, and the number is rapidly rising. Among adults under 30, the number is 1 in 3. Politically, this trend has obvious implications for the Republican Party, which, since Reagan, has relied heavily upon religious believers for support. It also has implications for the Democratic Party. The religiously unaffiliated now account for almost 1/4 of all registered voters who are Democrats or who lean Democratic. This expanding population group, sometimes called the nones, N-O-N-E-S, those who have no religious affiliation, is not, I would suggest, necessarily aggressively hostile to religious faith. Many of them are sometimes called seekers. But this group seems likely, by its very apathy, to be indifferent to the providential interpretation of American history that Ronald Reagan affirmed. This spreading secularization of the American electorate may in time limit the appeal of the faith-based rhetoric and substance of Reagan's creed. The third challenge to Reagan's American exceptionalism may be the most formidable of all: the accelerating phenomenon that we know as globalization, an extraordinary worldwide commingling of economies, peoples, and cultures, and the rise along with it of a post-national, even at times anti-national sensibility among cosmopolitan elites in many places. In some quarters, experts have begun to ask whether the traditional nation-state will eventually wither away. If so, will American exceptionalism die with it? Closely linked to these denationalizing tendencies here at home is the entrenched ideology known as multiculturalism, with its relativistic celebration, not so much of America's ideals or its singularity, but of its diversity. Given the enormity of these challenges, it would be foolish to speculate on the fate of Reagan's city upon a hill decades from now. Clearly, conservatives, for whom Reagan remains an inspiration, have much thinking to do. But as each generation of Americans takes up with what Walt Whitman called the burden and the lesson, we might derive some useful guidance from Reagan himself. "I never thought of myself as a great man," he told a friend in 1993. "Just a man committed to great ideas." Among the greatest of these for him was American exceptionalism. But Reagan was more than just a believer in America's uniqueness. He became, for his generation, America's bard, and beyond that, freedom's bard. For it was freedom that made America worth saving. "I've always believed that individuals should take priority over the state," he wrote. With that conviction, he went out and rallied his city upon a hill. And if he could do it, one might ask, why can't we? After all, he told us, we are Americans. Thank you.